She had known exactly what to say for 40 years. When the Millers lost their son in that car accident on Route 9, she was the one who brought the casserole and sat with them and said the right things about heaven. When her sister called from Houston after the miscarriage, she was the one who found the words. When her co-worker broke down in the parking lot after her mother's diagnosis, she was the one who prayed out loud, confidently, the way people do when they have been in church long enough to know the language. She knew the language. She was 61 years old, sitting in a Hampton Inn in Columbus, Ohio, 2 days before her husband's funeral, and the language was gone, not her faith. She was not sitting there thinking she no longer believed. It was something more honest than that. She was sitting there realizing she did not know what she believed. Exactly. About where he was. What he was doing. Whether any of the things she had said at other people's bedsides were true in the way she needed them to be true right now. The television was on. She had not watched it in an hour. His suit jacket was hanging on the back of the bathroom door because someone had packed it by mistake and she had not been able to move it. Every time she walked past it, she had to decide again whether to look at it or not look at it. She had been making that decision for 2 days. She picked up her Bible and opened it to John. Chapter 14. She had read this passage at 4 funerals. She read the first verse. She put the Bible down. She was not ready for what came next. Not yet. Outside the window, the parking lot moved at its ordinary speed. A man loading bags into a minivan. A woman in scrubs, walking fast with her keys already out. Ordinary life. Completely indifferent to the fact that she was sitting on the 4th floor, trying to remember what she actually believed about eternity. Most people do not think about heaven when life is easy. They think about heaven the way she was thinking about it now. Beside hospital beds. After phone calls they never wanted to receive. In hotel rooms 2 days before a funeral. In the quiet middle of ordinary nights when the question arrives without warning and there is nothing to do but sit with it. And what is striking, when you go back and look at the actual words Jesus said about heaven, is that he spoke about it in almost exactly those moments. He spoke to people who were afraid, to people who were dying, to people who had run out of options and out of time. He did not give lectures about the afterlife to comfortable crowds. He gave promises to desperate people, and the promises were not detailed descriptions of what eternity looks like. They were something more personal than that, and harder to dismiss. He did not give a map. He gave a direction, and the direction, every single time, pointed toward something that had less to do with geography and more to do with the oldest ache in the human chest. The feeling that this world, as good as it sometimes is, was never quite the whole story. That something is still unfinished. That something important is still coming. There are 12 things Jesus said about heaven. Not 12 facts. 12 moments. Each one given to a specific person in a specific crisis. Each one pointing somewhere that changes everything about how you think about what comes after. She sat in that chair until the parking lot was dark. Then she picked up the Bible again and started reading. Not because she had answers, because she had nowhere else to put the questions. The first thing Jesus said about heaven is that it is home. There is a man in his early 50s who had not been back to his hometown in 22 years. He left at 29, took a job in another city, built a life that did not require him to think about where he came from. He was not running from anything dramatic. He just left and kept going, and the years piled up, and the distance became normal. His father died on a Tuesday in March. He drove back alone. He took the exit off the interstate, and the road felt familiar, the way things feel familiar in dreams, where you know where you are before you can explain why. The hardware store on the corner was a nail salon now. The field where he played baseball at 11 was a storage facility. He turned onto the street where he grew up and the house was there. Same shape, same roofline, but painted a color his parents never would have chosen, with a different car in the driveway and a different name on the mailbox. He did not get out of the car. He sat there for a while. He knew the house would be different. He knew the town would be different. But there is a thing the mind does when someone you love dies. Where it reaches, for the last place it knew that person to be whole and present and real. And for him, that place was this house. And the house was full of someone else's life now. What he was missing was not the building. He understood that sitting in the car. What he was missing was what the building used to hold. The specific warmth of that kitchen. His father's voice coming from the other room. The particular feeling of walking through a door and being somewhere you belonged without having to explain it. Home is not an address. He had known that intellectually for years. He understood it completely now. On the night before Jesus was arrested, he sat at a table with 11 men who were beginning to understand that something was ending. Judas had already left. The room had the particular tension of a conversation where everyone knows something is wrong, and nobody wants to be the one who says it out loud. Jesus had washed their feet. He had broken bread. And the men sitting there were doing what people do when they are frightened and cannot admit it yet. They were listening very hard and understanding very little. And Jesus looked at them and said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Not here is information that will resolve your anxiety." The first thing he addressed was the fear underneath the questions. He saw what was actually happening in that room, and he spoke to it directly, before he said anything else. "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." The phrase Father's house would have meant something specific to the men in that room. In first-century Jewish life, the Father's house was not just a building. It was the center of the family's entire existence. It was where the generations came back to. It was where you were known not by what you had accomplished, but by whose you were. It was the place you could return to after failure, after absence, after years of going your own direction, and still be recognized, still belong. Jesus did not describe heaven by listing what it would contain. He described it by whose house it was. That is the first thing he said about it. And it is the most important. Heaven is not a reward facility. It is not a cosmic waiting room. It is a house, a Father's house. And in a Father's house, the defining question is not whether you are impressive enough to be there. The defining question is whether you are family. Many rooms. Some translations say many mansions, which carries the wrong feeling. The feeling of individual luxury suites, of earned accommodations. The word in the original is closer to dwelling places, spaces within a house where people live together. The point is not the square footage. The point is that there is room. Nobody arrives and finds that space has run out. Nobody is told the house is at capacity. There is a place for each person who belongs there. And belonging is determined not by achievement, but by relationship. I go to prepare a place for you. This sentence was spoken by a man who was about to be arrested, tried, tortured, and executed. He was hours away from the worst night of his life, and he spent that time telling frightened men that he was going ahead of them, that the purpose of what was coming was not just cosmic or theological, but personal. He was going to get the place ready. For them, specifically. There is something in that detail that is easy to read past. Preparing a place is not a distant, abstract action. It is what you do when you know someone is coming and you want them to know they are expected. It is what parents do before a child comes home from college. It is what families do before someone arrives after a long absence. The room is made ready not because the person needs luxury, but because the act of preparing says, "I knew you were coming. I have been thinking about you. There is a place here that is yours." The man in the car outside his childhood home drove away after a while. He did not know where else to go, so he drove to the church, where the funeral would be held, and sat in that parking lot too. He thought about something his father used to do. When the man was a boy and had been out too late, his father would leave the porch light on, not to watch for him, not to catch him, just so when he turned the corner at the end of the street, he could see from a distance that someone in that house was still awake and thinking about him. The light was the message. It said, "You are expected. You are not coming back to an empty house." He sat in the church parking lot and thought about the porch light for a long time. Heaven, the way Jesus described it, is a house where the light is on, where a place has been prepared for you specifically, by someone who knows exactly when you are arriving and has been thinking about you, not because you earned the right to come back, because you belong there, because the one who lives there calls it the Father's house. And that word, Father, is doing more work in that sentence than any of the other words around it. The woman in Columbus read past the first verse of John 14 that night. She read the whole chapter. She did not feel dramatically different when she finished, but she noticed she had stopped staring at the parking lot and started thinking about a Sunday morning 40 years ago, when she and her husband were new in town and did not know anyone at the church they walked into. And the woman in the third pew turned around before the service started and said, "Simply sit here. There is room." She had not thought about that woman in years. She did not even remember her name, but she remembered exactly how it felt to be told there was room. The second thing Jesus said about heaven is that it is a presence, not a place. There is a girl who is 8 years old sitting in a hospital hallway. Her mother is in the room at the end of the hall. Behind a door that has a sign on it, the girl cannot fully read, but understands means she cannot go in. She has been sitting in this hallway for 2 hours on a chair that is too big for her, with her feet not reaching the floor, holding a stuffed rabbit she has had since she was 3. A nurse walks by and asks if she is okay. She says yes. The nurse walks by again 15 minutes later and asks if she needs anything. She says no. What she needs is on the other side of that door. But she does not know how to explain that to the nurse. Because what she needs is not a thing. It is a person. And the person is behind the door with the sign. She is not thinking about whether her mother will be okay. She is not thinking about the future at all. She is only thinking about the distance between where she is sitting and where her mother is. 11 steps. She counted. 11 steps might as well be 1,000 miles. Most conversations about heaven focus on what it will be like, what it will feel like, what it will contain, whether we will recognize people we have loved. These are reasonable questions. They come from a real place. But they all circle around a deeper question that people rarely ask directly. Who will be there? Not as a crowd, as a presence. In the same conversation where Jesus talked about the Father's house, after he told the disciples about the many rooms and the prepared place, he said, "I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." The promise is not a place. The promise is a location defined by a person. Where I am. Not where heaven is located in the cosmos. Not where the best version of existence can be found. Where I am. The destination of eternity, in the way Jesus described it, is determined by proximity to him. Heaven is wherever he is, because he is the one who defines what that space becomes. Later that same night, in the prayer recorded in John 17, Jesus prayed to his Father, "I desire that they also whom you gave me may be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory." He did not pray that they would be comfortable. He did not pray that they would be relieved of suffering or granted long lives or given the things they had asked for. He prayed that they would be with him. That specific proximity, that particular presence. Think about the moments in your life when you were most afraid. Not afraid of a concept. Afraid in a specific room. On a specific night. About something specific that was happening or might happen What did you most want in those moments? Not information. Usually. Not even solution. In the first instant, what you wanted was someone to be in the room with you. Someone whose presence made the room different. Someone who, by being there, changed the quality of the fear, even when they could not change the circumstances. That is not a small thing. That is the thing. Jesus did not promise his disciples a comfortable afterlife. He promised them his company, and he spoke about it as if that was the whole point, as if all of eternity could be summarized in that one phrase, where I am. There you will be also. The girl in the hallway sat there for a long time. She did not go to the vending machine. She just sat and looked at the door and held the rabbit. Then a different nurse came out of the room. She walked down the hall and crouched down so she was at the girl's eye level and said, "Your mom is asking for you." The girl got off the chair. She walked down the hall. She went through the door. She did not say anything when she got to her mother's bedside. Her mother reached out her hand, and the girl took it and sat in the chair next to the bed. She did not need to be told that everything was going to be okay. She did not need explanations or timelines. She needed this. The hand. The same room. The 11 steps finally closed. That is what where I am. There, you may be also, sounds like, in plain human terms. Not a beautiful location. A closed distance. The woman in Columbus read that verse 3 times before she put the Bible down. She had read it before. Many times. But she had always read it as a promise about the future. About something that would happen later. After all of it, sitting in that hotel room, she read it as something else. As the answer to the question she had not been able to ask out loud since she got the call on Thursday afternoon. Where is he now? Not in the sense of geography. In the sense that actually mattered. She did not have a certain answer. But she had a direction. And in that room, at that hour, a direction was enough to breathe toward. The third thing Jesus said about heaven was said to a dying man with nothing left to offer. There is a hospice chaplain in Albuquerque who has been doing this work for 19 years. He has sat with people at the end of their lives more times than he can count. He has held hands with people who were afraid, and people who were ready, and people who were somewhere in between, which is most of them. He has prayed out loud when people asked him to and sat in silence when they did not. He has watched people die peacefully, and he has watched people die hard, and he has learned, over 19 years, that there is very little he can predict about how the end goes for any given person. But there is one thing he says he has noticed, a pattern that showed up early and never stopped showing up. The people who carry the most weight at the end are not usually the people who live the wildest lives. They are the people who have been carrying something specific for a very long time. A thing they did that they never made right. A relationship that ended badly and stayed that way. A version of themselves they are not proud of. That they thought they had outrun. That caught up with them in the bed where they no longer had the energy to keep running. He says the question he hears most often, in one form or another, is not, what happens after? It is this, is it too late for me? He has answered that question hundreds of times. He always tells the same story. It happened on a Friday afternoon outside the city walls of Jerusalem, on a hill called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. 3 men were being executed. Crucifixion was a Roman method designed not just to kill, but to humiliate. It was public. It was slow. It was meant to communicate something to everyone watching, which was that this is what happens to people who cause problems for the empire. The man in the middle had been accused of claiming to be the king of the Jews. The 2 men on either side of him were criminals. Luke does not specify what they had done. It only says that one of them, at some point during the hours they hung there together, turned his head toward the man in the middle and said something that has been recorded in a few dozen words of Greek and has been read for 2,000 years since. But before that man spoke, the other criminal spoke first. He said, "If you are really the Christ, save yourself and us." It was not a prayer. It was a dare. Maybe it was desperation wearing the mask of contempt. The text does not explain his motive. It just records the words. And then the second man spoke. He spoke to the first criminal, not to Jesus. He said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? We are receiving what we deserve for what we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus and said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Sit with that request for a moment, because it is one of the most precisely worded things anyone says to Jesus in any of the four Gospels. He did not ask to be saved from the cross. The cross was already happening. He did not ask for his sins to be listed and forgiven in formal terms. He asked to be remembered. He asked that when this man beside him, who was somehow a king, came into whatever kingdom he was talking about, that he would not be forgotten. That is a very small ask. And it came from a man who had nothing to offer in return. No future good behavior. No track record to point to. No time to make anything right. He had hours left to live. Whatever he had done to end up on that cross, there was no undoing it. There was only the asking. And the only currency he had was honesty. He knew what he deserved. He said so out loud. He was not negotiating. He was not performing. He was just one dying man turning to another dying man and asking not to be forgotten. Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." 3 words before the promise, "Truly I say." In the Gospel of Luke, this phrase marks the moments when Jesus is about to say something he wants the listener to receive completely. Not as possibility, as fact. Today, not eventually, not after a period of review, not pending further evaluation of the life you lived before this afternoon. Today, with me. The same phrase from John 14 appears here. Not you will go to a good place. You will be with me. The destination defined again by the person, not the location. Paradise. The word comes from an ancient Persian word for a walled garden, a protected enclosure, a place of beauty that exists because someone built walls around it to keep the outside out. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the same word was used for the Garden of Eden. The implication is not luxury. The implication is belonging inside something safe. Today you will be with me inside the walled garden. Now, there is something that has to be said here. Because, if it is not said, the story becomes something it is not meant to be. This exchange is not a policy statement. Jesus was not laying out a system. The man on the cross beside him was not demonstrating a technique. What Jesus saw in that man was something specific and real. An honest acknowledgement of guilt, a recognition of who Jesus was. Made not from a position of comfort or safety, but from a cross. While dying, with nothing to gain from saying it, except the saying of it. Underneath the asking was confession and trust, and a final turning toward the only one who could remember him rightly. That kind of honesty cost something. It cost that man whatever was left of his dignity. And Jesus answered it not with a lecture about what should have happened sooner, but with a promise about what was going to happen today. The hospice chaplain in Albuquerque says he has told this story to people who had lived what most people would call good lives, and people who had lived what most people would call terrible ones. And that in his experience the story lands differently depending on which you have done. But it lands for both. For the person who has lived carefully and faithfully, it lands as grace, as evidence that God is more generous than they feared. For the person who is not, it lands as something harder to name. He says he has watched people hear this story and cry in a way they have not cried in years. And that the crying is not grief exactly. It is closer to the feeling of putting down something very heavy that you have been carrying so long, you stopped noticing the weight. There was a man in this chaplain's care last spring, 73 years old. He had not been inside a church since his early 20s. He had done things he was not going to describe to anyone, including the chaplain. He was not interested in religion. He said. He had one question. If the chaplain could not answer it, he could leave. The question was, does it count if you mean it this late? The chaplain did not answer him directly. He told him about a Friday afternoon in Jerusalem, and a man who had no time left and asked only to be remembered. The old man listened. When the chaplain finished, the old man did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "He didn't clean up first." The chaplain said no. He didn't. The old man nodded, looked at the ceiling, nodded again. He died 4 days later. The chaplain does not know what happened in those 4 days on the inside. He only knows what he saw on the outside, which was a man who seemed to have put something down. Today you will be with me in paradise. It was said to a man with crimes on his record and a body that was already failing. It was said in the middle of a public execution, in the hearing of soldiers and bystanders and people who had come to watch, and people who had come to mourn. It was said without conditions or instructions for next steps. It was said the way you say something to a person who is out of time and knows it. When the most honest thing you can offer is not a process, but a promise. Today, with me, paradise. The fourth thing Jesus said about heaven is that nothing done in love disappears. There is a woman named Carol who taught 3rd grade at an elementary school in rural Kentucky for 31 years. She was not famous. She did not win state teaching awards, though she should have. She drove a 2003 Civic with 200,000 miles on it and bought her own classroom supplies every year with money she did not have much of. And she did this without complaint, because complaining about it seemed like a waste of energy she needed for other things. Every morning, before the students arrived, she wrote each of their names on the whiteboard. Not as a tendance, not as a list. She wrote them large, in her careful print, because she wanted each child who walked through that door to see their name waiting for them, to know that before the day began, before they did anything right or wrong or mediocre, someone had already been thinking about them. 31 years, more than 800 students. She wrote every name. She retired in June of 2017. There was a small gathering in the cafeteria, a sheet cake, a card signed by the staff. Then she went home to the house she had lived in alone since her husband left in 2004. And the next morning she woke up and there was nowhere to be. 3 weeks after she retired, she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of lymphoma. She spent the next 14 months in and out of treatment. She did not tell many people. She was not the kind of person who wanted attention for suffering. She just went to her appointments and came home and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the yard. What she thought about, in those hours, in the chair, was not her accomplishments. She had not published anything. She had not built anything that would outlast her. She had not accumulated much. What she thought about was the names on the board, whether any of them had mattered, whether any of it had stayed with anyone after they left her classroom and went on to the next grade and the next teacher and the next decade. She had no way to know. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said something to a crowd of people who were also not famous. They were farmers and fishermen and laborers and women who managed households with very little margin. They were not people who had much to lose to moths or rust, which makes what he said to them slightly more interesting. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The image Jesus was using was a storehouse, a place where you put things you intend to keep, On earth, he said, the storehouses fail. The things you put in them get destroyed or taken. His audience knew exactly what it felt like to work hard and watch what you built erode. Moths in the grain, rust on the tools. Someone stronger deciding your things were now their things. But there is another kind of storehouse, he said. One that does not fail. One where what you put in stays. He did not specify exactly what goes into this storehouse. He did not give a list. He said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is an observation about how human beings work. We follow what we invest in. We track the things we have put something of ourselves into. And if what you invest in is the category of things that do not last, you will spend your life managing losses. But if what you invest in is the category of things that do last, then what you are building has a different kind of permanence. The things that survive in the permanent storehouse, based on what Jesus taught across the Gospels, are not financial or material. They are the products of love and faithfulness and truth and attention given when no one was offering anything in return. The honest words spoken at personal cost. The kindness given when no one was watching. The love given to someone who could not give anything back. These things do not appear on any ledger that human institutions keep. They are not tracked by performance reviews or recognized at retirement parties, or measured by the metrics any system uses to determine who mattered. But Jesus said they are kept, stored somewhere that moths cannot find and rust cannot reach, and no one can break into and take. 8 months after Carol's diagnosis, a letter arrived at her house. It had been forwarded twice, first to the school and then to her home address, because the person who sent it did not have her direct information. The letter was from a man named David, who was 38 years old and lived in Cincinnati. He said he had been in her 3rd grade class in 1996. He said he had been going through his mother's house after she passed and found a folder his mother had kept. In the folder was a drawing he had made in 3rd grade. And on the back of the drawing, in a child's handwriting, he had written, Mrs. Carol wrote my name on the board today. He said he did not know why he had written that down. He said he did not even remember doing it. But he had been thinking about it since he found the folder. And he looked her up because he wanted her to know that he remembered her class as the first place he ever felt like he was expected somewhere. Like someone had thought about him before he arrived. He did not know she was sick. He was not writing because he had heard she was dying. He was writing because he had found a piece of paper that a 7-year-old version of himself had thought was important enough to record. Carol read the letter in the chair by the window. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands for a while. She died the following spring. The letter was on the table beside her bed when she went. Jesus said, "Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven." He said this to people who did not have much to lay up anywhere. He was describing a kind of accounting system that runs parallel to every human accounting system and does not share any of their weaknesses. Nothing done in love is lost in that system. Nothing given in faithfulness disappears. Nothing offered in truth to someone who needed it is subtracted from the record when the giver leaves. It is kept, all of it, somewhere that moths cannot find and rust cannot reach and no one can break into and take. Carol never found out whether any of the other names on the board had stayed with anyone. She found out about one, David in Cincinnati, who was 7 years old in 1996 and thought it was worth writing down that someone had written his name. She never knew about the others. But the not knowing is not the same as the not mattering. That is the whole point of what Jesus said. What you cannot see being kept is still being kept. The 5th thing Jesus said about heaven is that God remembers what the world forgot. There is a man named Robert who told the truth in a meeting and lost his job because of it. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no cameras. Nobody was going to make a movie about what happened in that conference room in downtown Atlanta on a Wednesday afternoon in February. It was just a room with 12 people in it, and a presentation on a screen, and a number that Robert knew was wrong and had been told. Quietly, before the meeting started. Not to bring up. He brought it up. He was not trying to be a hero. He had been at that company for 11 years. He had a daughter in her second year of college, and a mortgage on a house that was not finished being paid for. He brought up the number because it was wrong, and because the decision being made on that number was going to affect people he had worked alongside for over a decade. And he could not sit in a room and watch a wrong thing happen without saying so. The meeting ended. His manager pulled him aside afterward. He was gone by Friday. The company made the decision anyway. 18 months later. The consequences landed exactly the way Robert had said they would. The project failed. People lost jobs. An internal review confirmed the problems had been foreseeable. Nobody called Robert. Nobody sent an email. The review was not made public. He found out from a former colleague who texted him a link to an internal document that had been leaked. He read it in the parking lot of a grocery store where he was picking up dinner. He sat there for a while after he finished reading. He had been right. It had cost him everything, and nobody was going to say so out loud, and the people who made the decision he warned against were still employed, and he was not. He drove home. He made dinner. He did not tell his wife about the document. She had been through enough already. In the 5th chapter of Matthew, near the end of the Beatitudes, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." This passage has been used to mean many different things over many years. Some of them accurate, and some of them not. It has been used to make ordinary inconvenience sound like martyrdom. It has been used to discourage legitimate questions about institutions by suggesting that anyone who raises concerns is persecuting the righteous. These are misuses, and they are worth naming. But underneath the misuses, there is something Jesus was pointing at that is real, and that people who have lived it know is real. There is a specific kind of loss that comes from doing the right thing in a system that does not reward the right thing. Loss caused not by personal failure or laziness or bad decisions, but by the gap between what is true and what is convenient for the people with the power to decide what happens next. Loss that falls on the person who said the true thing at the moment it cost them to say it, and who then watched the people who said the convenient thing continue on without consequence. This kind of loss is extremely common. It does not usually make the news. It happens in offices and schools and families and churches and city councils and hospital boards and every other human structure where the people at the top have interests that do not always align with the truth. And then the system moves on, and the person who told the truth is gone, and there is no public accounting. Jesus saw this. He did not say, "Be more strategic." He did not say, "Find a way to tell the truth that does not threaten the people in power." He said, "Your reward is great in heaven." The word reward in the Greek is misthos. It means a wage, a payment for work done, not a bonus or a soniment. Something the record reflects, because the record is accurate, and the one keeping it does not forget faithfulness. The important thing is not a transaction but a recognition. Not because God is forced by any external system, but because Jesus describes the Father as one who sees what is done in secret and does not revise the record based on who has the louder voice. This is what the phrase "great reward in heaven" is actually pointing at. A verdict, the final and uncorruptible verdict on what actually happened, spoken by someone who saw all of it and cannot be bought or pressured or managed into silence. Heaven, in this dimension, is the place where the true story of every human life is finally told in full. where what was done in hidden rooms is brought into the open, where the person who was told they were wrong for saying the true thing is told, by the one whose opinion is the only one that ultimately holds, what actually happened and what it actually was worth. Jesus connected this promise to the prophets. He said, "The people who persecuted you persecuted them too." This is not just historical context. It is a way of saying you are part of a long line of people who told the truth at personal cost and were not vindicated in their own lifetimes. Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern. Amos was told by the priest of Bethel to go home and never prophesy there again. These men said true things to people who did not want to hear true things. And the response from the people who did not want to hear was to remove the messenger. Jesus told his followers, "That is the company you are in." And he said it like it was something to take seriously, not something to be embarrassed about. There is another person worth sitting with here. Not famous, not a prophet by any formal designation. Her name was Agnes, and she lived in a small town in Georgia, and she spent 37 years taking care of first her parents and then her husband through illnesses that did not move quickly but did not stop moving. She did not have a career in the formal sense. She did not publish anything or build anything or accumulate anything of note. She cooked and cleaned and drove to appointments and sat in waiting rooms and learned the language of diagnoses and medications and insurance forms. And she did all of this without anyone organizing a ceremony to recognize it. She died at 79, 2 years after her husband, in the same house she had lived in for 51 years. At her funeral, which was small, a woman who had known her for decades stood up and said she had asked Agnes once if she ever felt like her life had been too small. Agnes had thought about it for a moment and then said, "I don't think the size of it is what matters. I think the direction of it is what matters. The size of it is not what matters. The direction of it is what matters." Robert found another job 8 months after he lost the first one. It paid less. The work was less interesting. He did not have the same standing. He was not miserable, but he was aware every day of the distance between where he was and where he had expected to be by this point in his life. He went to church most Sundays. He was not someone who talked about his faith very much, but he had a Bible that had been given to him by his grandmother when he was 17. And every few months he would open it to something and read it not as a religious exercise, but as a person who had questions and was looking for whether anyone had addressed them honestly. One Sunday afternoon he opened to Matthew 5. He read the Beatitudes again, slowly, the way you read something you have read before, but are reading now from a different place in your life. When he got to the part about rejoice and be glad, he stopped. He did not feel like rejoicing. He was not going to pretend he did. But there was something in the phrase, "Great is your reward in heaven," that landed differently than it had the last time he read it. It landed like a statement of fact, rather than a promise of feeling better. Like someone saying, "I saw what happened. I know what it cost. I know what was never said out loud. And I am telling you that the silence of the people who should have spoken is not the final word on the matter." He is not sure he believes it completely. He is working on it. But he keeps the Bible open on the desk in his home office. He has not put it away. Righteousness without vindication is still righteousness. And the vindication, when it comes, will be complete. The sixth thing Jesus said about heaven is that the table is longer than anyone expected. There is a woman named Yolanda who came to the United States from the Dominican Republic in 2008 with 2 suitcases and a phone number written on a piece of paper. The phone number was for a cousin she had met once at a family gathering when she was 11. She did not know if the number still worked. She called it from the airport in Miami, and it rang 4 times, and then someone answered, and it was not her cousin, but it was someone who knew her cousin, and that was enough to start. She spent the first 3 years in a city where she did not know anyone well, and did not speak the language well enough to be understood without effort. which meant that every conversation was a small negotiation between what she was trying to say and what came out, and how the person on the other end decided to respond to the gap. Most people were patient. Some were not. She learned very quickly to read the difference between a person who was going to wait while she found the word and a person who had already decided what she was before she finished speaking. She found a church, not because she was especially religious, but because it was a place where Spanish was spoken on Sunday mornings, and she needed to be in a room where she did not have to negotiate every word. She went for the language and stayed for other reasons that took her longer to name. The church had a Thanksgiving dinner every November that was open to the whole neighborhood. Not just the congregation. Anyone could come. Tables were set up in the fellowship hall and people brought food, and there was always more than enough, and the room was always fuller than anyone expected. The first year Yolanda went, she did not know what to bring. She made a dish from home. Something her mother used to make. Because it was the only thing she knew how to make well enough to share. She carried it on the bus and walked 3 blocks from the stop, and came through the door of the fellowship hall and stood at the edge of the room for a moment, holding her dish, looking at a room full of people she did not know. A woman named Barbara, who had been a member of that church for 30 years and who had helped set up these dinners since before Yolanda was born, walked over to her immediately, not because she had a protocol for welcoming newcomers, because she saw a woman standing at the edge of a room holding food and looking like she was calculating whether it was too late to leave. Barbara said, "You brought something. Good. Come with me. We need more room on that table." She took the dish from Yolanda's hands and walked toward the food table and looked back to make sure Yolanda was following. She set the dish down and lifted the lid and said, "What is this? It smells incredible. You have to stand here and tell people what it is, because they are going to ask." Yolanda stood by the table. People did ask. Someone asked for the recipe. Someone else asked where she was from. By the time the dinner started, she was sitting at a table with Barbara and Barbara's husband and 2 other couples, and a teenager who spent most of the meal on his phone, and a very old man named Harold, who had traveled to the Dominican Republic in 1972, and remembered specific things about it that surprised her. She did not go home early. In the 8th chapter of Matthew, a Roman centurion came to Jesus and asked him to heal his servant. The centurion was not Jewish. He had no standing in the religious community Jesus belonged to. He was, by every category of that culture, an outsider. And yet he spoke to Jesus with a directness and a faith that Jesus described as greater than anything he had encountered in Israel. And then Jesus said something that expanded the frame of the entire conversation beyond anything the centurion had asked about. He said, "I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Many, from east and west, from every direction, from every place where people live and work and carry their suitcases and learn new languages and stand at the edge of rooms trying to decide whether to come in." The image he used was a table, not an administrative process, not a pageant system, a table. In the ancient world, a table meant belonging. You did not sit and eat with people you had not accepted. The table was where the host communicated to everyone present that the people seated here were welcome here. In Luke 14, Jesus told a parable about a man who threw a great banquet. He invited guests. The guests made excuses and did not come. The host sent his servant out into the streets to bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. When there was still room, he sent the servant further out, to the roads and the hedges, to bring in more people so that the house would be full. The house would be full. Not the minimum number of attendees would be reached. The house would be full because the host wanted it full. Because a table set for a feast that nobody comes to is not a feast. The point of the table is the people at it. Now, what Jesus was describing here is not a picture of everyone automatically arriving at the table, regardless of anything. He taught elsewhere about the seriousness of responding to the invitation, about the choice involved, about what it means to actually come when asked. Those things are real, and they belong in the full picture. But this image, the banquet, the host who keeps sending out the call, the many from east and west, is also real, and it belongs in the picture too. It is a corrective to the version of heaven that is small and exclusive, and resembles a private club more than a feast. The God Jesus described is not a reluctant host who admits people grudgingly after checking credentials at the door. He is a host who has prepared more food than could be needed, and has sent people out in every direction to say, "Come in." There is room enough for all who come. And that phrase, "all who come," carries both the width of the invitation and the reality of the response it requires. Yolanda has been at that church for 14 years now. She helps set up the Thanksgiving dinner. She is the one who walks to the door when she sees someone standing at the edge of the room with food in their hands, and the look on their face that she recognizes because she wore it herself once. Barbara died 3 years ago. Yolanda spoke at her funeral. She said Barbara was the first person in this country who took something out of her hands, and that she did not know, standing in that doorway with a dish from her mother's kitchen, that a woman walking toward her was about to change what the word welcome meant to her for the rest of her life. She said, "I did not know I was hungry until she fed me." And I do not mean the food. Jesus used the image of a table because a table is something everyone understands. Everyone knows what it means to be outside a room where people are eating together. Everyone knows what it means to be invited in. Many will come from east and west, from places you would not expect, carrying dishes from kitchens you have never heard of, arriving with the look on their faces of people who were not sure they would be welcome and are just now finding out that they are. And the table is longer than anyone standing outside it imagined. The host made sure of that before anyone arrived. The seventh thing Jesus said about heaven is that the small enter first. There is a man named Daniel who built a company from nothing over 20 years. Not a famous company. A regional logistics company in the Midwest that moved freight and employed about 200 people at its peak and paid its bills and was, by any reasonable measure, a success. Daniel had started it in his late 20s with a used truck and a contract he was not sure he could fulfill. And he had grown it by working longer hours than was good for him and making decisions that kept him awake at night and learning, slowly and expensively, from the ones that did not work out. He was good at it. He knew he was good at it. That knowledge was not arrogance exactly, but it was something close to it. A settled confidence in his own judgment that had been earned through enough hard experience to feel legitimate. He trusted himself. He had learned to trust himself, because trusting himself had generally produced results. His son Marcus was 5 years old when Daniel was 44. Marcus had been praying since he was 3, the way some children do when they are taught early, and it takes hold in a way that nobody fully plans for. He prayed at meals and at bedtime, and sometimes randomly in the middle of the afternoon when something occurred to him that he wanted to mention to God. His prayers were specific in the way that small children's prayers are specific, completely unconcerned with whether the request was appropriately sized or spiritually sophisticated. One evening, Daniel sat on the edge of Marcus's bed to listen while Marcus prayed before sleep. Marcus prayed for the dog, who had been limping. He prayed for his friend Jacob, whose birthday was coming, and who wanted a specific kind of toy that Marcus had already priced out at the dollar store because he wanted to contribute something. He prayed for the family down the street whose house had a sign in the yard that Marcus had asked about, and Daniel had explained as best he could. He prayed that his dad would not have to work so much. Then he said amen and pulled the blanket up and was asleep within 4 minutes. Daniel sat in the dark room for a while after Marcus's breathing evened out. Something had shifted in the room during that prayer, or in him, and he could not name it precisely. Marcus had prayed the way someone talks to a person they are completely certain is listening. No hedging. No formal language. No awareness that he might be asking for things outside the appropriate scope of divine interest. He just talked to God the way he talked to Daniel. Directly. With the full confidence that the person on the other end cared about whatever he brought up. Daniel had not prayed like that since he was a child. He could not remember exactly when it had changed. In the 18th chapter of Matthew, the disciples came to Jesus with a question. The question was, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? It sounds like a simple question. It was not. It was a question about hierarchy and status and positioning, asked by men who had been traveling with Jesus long enough to believe that their proximity to him translated into some kind of advantage in whatever was coming next. They wanted to know the ranking system. They wanted to know where they stood. Jesus did not answer the question directly. He called a child over and placed the child in the middle of the group and said, "Truly, I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." The child standing in the middle of that group of adult men had no status in first-century Jewish society. Children were not consulted on decisions. They were not given places of honor at tables. They were cared for and loved. But they were not respected the way people with accomplishments and positions and track records were respected. They were dependent in a way that adults spent their entire lives trying not to be. That was the point. When Jesus said, "Become like this child," he was not romanticizing childhood innocence or suggesting that ignorance is preferable to knowledge. He was pointing at something specific about the position of a child relative to a parent. The honest acknowledgement of complete dependence. The absence of the pretense of self-sufficiency. The willingness to receive what is given without insisting you earned it. The disciples were asking about greatness. Jesus answered them with a child, because the child was the most honest person in the room. The child was not managing an image. The child was not calculating what the answer would mean for his standing. The child was just there, present and small, and not pretending to be otherwise. The issue Jesus was identifying was not first a moral one. It was a posture. The disciples had come with a question about rank. Jesus answered with a picture of someone who had never thought about rank because they had nothing to rank with. And he said that is the one who understands how this works. In the 19th chapter of Matthew, people brought children to Jesus so he could lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked them. They were doing what assistants to important people do when they believe their job is to protect the important person's time from requests that do not rise to the appropriate level. Children were not at the appropriate level. Jesus was not pleased. He said, "Let the children come to me, and do not hinder them. For to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." To such belongs. Not such people will eventually be allowed in after meeting the necessary requirements. The kingdom belongs to them. It is theirs the way something belongs to a person who fits it, who was made for it, who arrives and finds that everything is the right size. There is an inversion happening in what Jesus said that takes a moment to absorb. The people the disciples were protecting Jesus from were the ones he identified as natural inhabitants of the kingdom, and the people who were managing access, the ones with the authority to decide who was worth the teacher's time, were the ones being told they needed to change something fundamental about themselves before they could enter. The change he identified was not about accumulating more. It was about arriving differently. The person who has spent decades in church, who knows the theology, who has served in leadership roles and given generously and maintained a respectable reputation. That person is not being told their record is bad. They are being told their record is not the point. The point is the posture. The child does not arrive at the parent's knee with a portfolio. The child arrives because they are the child and this is the parent, and that relationship is the whole basis of the coming. Jesus was saying that the kingdom of heaven works on the logic of that relationship. not the logic of credentials. Daniel sat in his son's room for longer than he planned. When he got up and went back downstairs, he did not return to the work he had been planning to return to. He sat in the kitchen for a while, with no particular purpose. He had been thinking lately about prayer, about how he had moved over the years from the kind Marcus had demonstrated tonight to something that felt more like a business communication. Structured, purposeful, focused on what he needed and whether it was reasonable to expect it, and whether he had held up his end sufficiently to justify making the request. He had made prayer into something that looked a lot like everything else he did, a negotiation between what he wanted and what he could justify asking for. Marcus had not negotiated. Marcus had just talked to God about the dog. Daniel stayed in the kitchen until almost midnight. He did not accomplish anything. He did not make any decisions or solve any problems. At some point he prayed, not the way he usually did, more like the way Marcus had. He did not prepare anything in advance. He just said what was there, which was that he was not sure he knew how to do this anymore, and that he was aware of the gap between the person he presented to the world and the person he actually was inside that gap, and that he was tired in a way that the business had not caused and the business could not fix. He was not sure it counted as prayer exactly. It did not feel like what he thought prayer was supposed to feel like, but it felt honest. More honest than anything he had said in a room full of people in a long time. The kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Not to the most impressive. Not to the most certain. Not to the people who have figured out the right language and maintained the right associations and built the right record. To the ones who come small. Who come without a portfolio. Who come the way Marcus came to the edge of sleep. Talking to God about the dog and the friend's birthday and the family down the street, and the dad who works too much, who come the way children come to a parent, because they are the child, and this is the father, and that is the whole reason they are there. There is something worth saying directly before we go further. 7 chapters in, if you have been paying attention, there is a shape to what Jesus said about heaven that is undeniably beautiful. A father's house with room for the people who belong there. A presence that closes every distance. A promise given to a dying man with nothing left to offer. A storehouse where nothing done in love is lost. A verdict that corrects every earthly misreading. A table where people come from every direction and find a place set for them. A kingdom that belongs to the small and the honest and the dependent. These things are all in the record. Jesus said them. They are not invented or selected to make a comfortable case. They are there. But Jesus also said other things about heaven. Things that are in the same Gospels, spoken by the same voice, and that do not receive the same attention in most conversations about eternity. Not because they are obscure, because they are uncomfortable, because they complicate the version of heaven that is easiest to want. He said that the way is narrow and few find it. He said there will be people who are certain they belong there, who will discover they were wrong. He said that what is required is not a performance of religion but a transformation of the self, and that the transformation is real and goes all the way down. These are not separate teachings from a different, harsher version of Jesus. They are part of the same conversation, spoken by the same man who told the disciples to let the children come, who promised paradise to the man dying beside him, who described a host who keeps sending servants out to fill the table. The same Jesus, which means the full picture of heaven, the one he was actually describing, is not simply comfort and welcome and belonging and grace. It is all of those things. And it is also something that requires something of the person entering it. Something that cannot be faked and cannot be performed and cannot be accumulated by knowing the right language. The next chapters do not walk away from the beauty of what came before. They walk deeper into it. Because the heaven Jesus described is beautiful in a way that is more demanding than comfortable, and more honest than either. If what he said about the Father's house is true, then what he said about the narrow way is also true. And if both are true at the same time, the question is not which one to believe. The question is what it means that a God who prepares a place for you is also a God who tells you that you will need to be made into something different to live there. That is not a contradiction. It is the same love, operating at a depth most of us have not yet reached. The eighth thing Jesus said about heaven is that religious performance is not the same as knowing him. There is a woman named Patricia who has not missed a Sunday service in 23 years. She knows this because she used to keep track. Not out of pride, exactly, though pride was probably in it somewhere, but out of the same instinct that makes certain people balance their checkbooks to the penny. She liked the number. She liked what the number said about her. 23 years of Sundays. She had been there through 2 pastoral changes and a building campaign and a split over worship style that took 3 families with it, and a season when attendance dropped so low the board considered merging with another congregation. She had been there through all of it. She was the kind of person a church is built around. Reliable and present and known. The person the pastor mentions when he wants to illustrate faithfulness. She served on 2 committees. She had led the women's Bible study for 11 years. She knew the theological vocabulary of her tradition with the fluency of someone who has been immersed in it for decades, which meant she could speak the language of faith in any register, casual or formal, with newcomers or with scholars, in a way that was indistinguishable from native speech. What she had not told anyone, including her husband, was that somewhere around year 14 she had stopped feeling anything. Not doubt in the formal sense. Not a crisis of belief that could be named and addressed. Something quieter and in some ways more troubling than that. She kept going to church and leading the Bible study and serving on the committees and saying the right things in the right moments. And the machinery of it continued to function perfectly. And inside the machinery, there was a hollow space that she did not know what to do with. She had tried to address it. She had read books. She had attended a retreat. She had prayed more consistently and less consistently and in different ways. And none of it had filled the hollow space. And eventually she had arrived at a kind of accommodation with it. A decision not made consciously, but arrived at gradually. To keep doing the things and not think too hard about what was or was not underneath them. She was good at the doing. She would keep doing. In the 7th chapter of Matthew, near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name?' And then will I declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" This passage makes people uncomfortable for different reasons, depending on who they are. For people outside the church, it confirms a suspicion they have long held, that religious performance and genuine faith are not the same thing, that the most visibly religious people are not automatically the most genuinely transformed. This part of what Jesus said lands for them as something they already suspected. For people inside the church, particularly people who have been inside a long time and have the record to show for it, it lands differently. It lands as a question directed specifically at them. Because the people Jesus described in this passage were not hypocrites in the obvious sense. They were not people who secretly believed nothing and cynically performed religion for social benefit. They were people who had done real things, prophesied, cast out demons, performed mighty works. They had done them in Jesus' name. They had associated themselves with the right person. And he said to them, "I never knew you. Not I knew you, but you did not do enough. Not I knew you, but your record had too many failures. I never knew you. The relationship did not exist. Everything else had existed. The activities, the vocabulary, the associations, the works, which were not small works, but underneath all of it there was no actual relationship. And the absence of the relationship made everything built on top of it into something Jesus called lawlessness. Patricia had read this passage many times. She had taught it. She had explained it to women in her Bible study. She had always framed it as a warning against hypocrisy, against the kind of obvious, cynical religious performance that she assumed was what Jesus was describing. It had not occurred to her, until a particular Tuesday evening in October, that she might be closer to the people in the passage than she had understood. The Tuesday evening happened like this. The Bible study had ended, and the women had left, and she was cleaning up the coffee cups, and she stopped in the middle of the room, for no reason she could identify, and stood there, holding 2 cups, and thought, if someone asked me right now whether I actually know him, what would I say? Not whether she had attended faithfully, not whether she knew the theology, not whether she had served consistently, whether she actually knew him. She stood there for a long time holding the cups. The discomfort of this passage is that it refuses to let religious activity substitute for the thing religious activity is supposed to be pointing toward. The activities are not the problem. Attending church and leading Bible studies and serving on committees, these things are not the problem. The problem is when they become the destination rather than the road. When the doing of religious things replaces the knowing of the person those things are supposed to connect you to. When you learn to maintain the appearance of relationship so well that you stop noticing the relationship itself has gone quiet. Jesus was not warning against sincerity. He was warning against the specific and very human capacity to invest so much in the performance of faith that the performance crowds out the thing being performed. To learn the language so thoroughly that you stop noticing you are speaking it from memory rather than from the heart. To build such a complete external structure that nobody from the outside, including sometimes yourself, you can see that the interior it was built around has been vacated. The phrase "I never knew you" points in both directions. It is a statement about a relationship that did not develop, which means the corrective is not more activity. It is not better performance of the existing activities. It is the thing the activities were always pointing toward and somehow never quite reached. The actual knowing. The turning toward the person rather than the turning toward the duties associated with the person. Jesus said elsewhere in the Gospels that eternal life is this, to know the only true God and Jesus Christ whom he has sent. The word for knowing there carries the sense of deep, personal, experiential knowledge. The knowledge that comes from time spent with a person. From showing up honestly. Not just showing up. From bringing your actual self into an actual relationship, rather than sending a well-prepared representative. Patricia stood in the room with the coffee cups for a long time. She was not having a dramatic experience. Nothing shifted in the atmosphere. There was no voice and no vision. She was just a woman in her late 50s, standing in a church fellowship hall on a Tuesday night, holding 2 cups and being honest with herself for what felt like the first time in a long time. She thought, I know everything about this. I do not know him the way I know about this. She did not quit the Bible study. She did not leave the church. She did not make any external change that anyone around her would have noticed. But she started, that Tuesday, doing something she had not done in years. She started showing up to prayer the way Marcus showed up to prayer, without a prepared presentation, without the vocabulary she had accumulated, without the performance she had built so carefully that it had become invisible to her. She just showed up, honestly, as the person she actually was, rather than the person she had constructed. The first few times it felt wrong. It felt inadequate. She was used to being good at the religious things, and this felt like being a beginner, which she had not been in a very long time. She kept going anyway. There is a reason Jesus placed this warning in the Sermon on the Mount, rather than pulling someone aside and saying it to them privately. He said it to everyone, in public, in the middle of a larger conversation about what genuine faith looks like from the inside out, rather than the outside in. He was not trying to make sincere people despair about their standing. He was trying to interrupt a pattern before it completed itself. The pattern of mistaking the map for the territory, of learning the language of a place so well that you stop noticing you have never actually been there. The warning is an act of mercy. It is what you say to someone you love before they reach the end of a long road and discover it went somewhere they did not intend. Patricia still leads the Bible study. She is still on the 2 committees. She has not missed a Sunday. But she told the women in her Bible study something different last spring than she would have told them 10 years ago. She told them about the Tuesday evening and the coffee cups and the question she had stood with. She did not package it with a resolution. She did not end the story at the point where everything was better. She said, "I have been doing this for a long time, and I am just learning what it is." The room was quiet, in a way rooms are not usually quiet during Bible study. Then a woman who had been coming for 3 months and had never said very much said, "Me too." And then 3 more women said it. They had all been there, inside the machinery, doing the things and carrying the hollow space and not knowing what to do with it. The passage they studied that night was not the passage Patricia had planned. They stayed 2 hours past when the group was supposed to end. Nobody seemed to want to leave. The 9th thing Jesus said about heaven is that it is a reality we must be made fit to inhabit. There is a man named Thomas who was released from prison on a Thursday morning in April. He had been inside for 7 years. He had gone in at 34, and he was coming out at 41, and the 7 years had changed him in ways he could not fully account for yet. Some of the changes he was aware of. Some he would not discover for months. In small moments when he reacted to something in a way that surprised him, and then understood where the reaction came from. He had a bag with his belongings and $75 from the state of Ohio, and a phone number for a halfway house, and the name of a parole officer he was required to contact within 24 hours. He stood outside the facility for a moment in the cold April air and looked at the parking lot and the road beyond it and the ordinary world going about its ordinary business. And he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not relief. Not freedom. Exactly. Though that was in it somewhere. He felt unprepared. Not for the logistics. He had thought about the logistics for years. He was unprepared for who he was going to be outside. For the question of what the 7 years had made him, and whether what they had made him was something he wanted to carry forward, or something he needed to figure out how to set down. He was not the person he had been at 34. That person had made specific choices that led to a specific outcome. And Thomas had had 7 years to sit with those choices, and what they had cost, and what they said about who he had been. He did not want to be that person again. But he was not sure yet who he was instead. He stood in the parking lot for a few minutes. Then he walked to the bus stop. In the 5th chapter of Matthew, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." This sentence has been used badly in a number of directions over a very long time. It has been used to suggest that heaven requires an impossible standard of personal perfection, which produces either despair in honest people or self-deception in dishonest ones. Neither of those readings reflects what Jesus was actually saying, and the reason is visible in who he was talking about. The scribes and Pharisees were not bad people in the straightforward sense. They were the most rigorously observant religious people in their society. They kept the law with a precision and a completeness that most people could not match. They tithed everything, including the small herbs from their gardens. They fasted twice a week. They knew the scriptures with a depth that scholars today would respect, by any visible metric. They were the most righteous people in the room. And Jesus said, unless your righteousness exceeds theirs, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. The word exceed in the Greek carries the sense of overflowing, of going beyond the limits of a container. Jesus was not saying do more of what the Pharisees do. He was saying the kind of righteousness that matters for the kingdom is a different kind. Not more in quantity, but different in nature. Not an external performance carried out with greater precision, but an internal reality that produces external behavior as its natural outgrowth rather than its strategic display. He spends the rest of Matthew 5 showing what he means. You have heard it said, do not murder. But I say to you, deal with the anger underneath. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, deal with what is happening in your interior before it reaches your hands. You have heard it said, love your neighbor. But I say to you, love your enemy. Because the love that only extends to the people who are easy to love is not yet the kind of love the kingdom runs on. The pattern is consistent. The external behavior is not the problem. The problem is the distance between the behavior and the source it is supposed to be coming from. Righteousness that originates in wanting to be seen as righteous is not the same as righteousness that originates in actually being the kind of person who cannot do otherwise. Then in verse 48 Jesus said, you therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. The word perfect in the Greek carries the sense of being complete, whole, brought to the fullness of what something was designed to be. It does not only mean flawless performance. It points toward a person who has been brought to the goal for which they were made. A teleos person is not someone who has never failed. It is someone who is becoming what they were always meant to become. This is not a standard anyone achieves alone. That is not a loophole or a comforting revision of a hard saying. It is the point. The standard is the description of what the process of transformation is working toward. Not an entry requirement, standing at the door, demanding you meet it before you come in. Heaven is not simply a place you travel to after death if your record clears a threshold. It is a reality you are being shaped to inhabit. The shaping is the whole of the life of faith. The point of every discipline and every difficulty and every moment when you are confronted with the gap between who you are and who you are being called to become is that the gap is being worked on by something other than your own effort alone, though your effort is part of it, by something that is doing in you what you cannot do in yourself. This does not mean sin does not matter. It does not mean the choices you make have no weight. They have enormous weight. What you practice, you become. What you orient yourself toward, you move toward. The person who spends years practicing dishonesty is being shaped by that practice. And the shaping is real and has consequences that extend beyond the immediate moment. But the point is not the performance of righteousness to meet a standard. The point is the transformation that makes righteousness natural. That makes it the outflow of a changed interior, rather than the output of a religious machine running on reputation management. Thomas got off the bus at the halfway house. He met his parole officer the next morning. He got a job at a restaurant 3 weeks later, washing dishes, which was not what he had done before and was not what he had imagined doing at 41. But it was work, and it was honest, and he could do it without pretending to be someone he was not yet. He had started going to a church near the halfway house, not because anyone told him to, and not because he had been religious before, but because one of the men at the halfway house went on Sunday mornings, and Thomas had nothing else to do that first Sunday, and he went along. The church was small and not particularly impressive, and the pastor was not a great speaker, but was clearly a genuine person. And Thomas found that he could sit in that room without performing anything, without managing how he was perceived, without any of the strategic self-presentation that had been part of his life before. He could just sit there. That was permitted. He was not sure what he believed. He was not sure what was happening in him, But something was happening, something slow and not dramatic. Something that felt less like being told what to do and more like being worked on from the inside, in a way he did not fully understand and was not yet ready to describe. One Sunday, the pastor preached on Matthew 5. He talked about what that word perfect actually meant. He said it was about becoming what you were made to be. He said the whole Christian life was the process of that becoming, and that it was not finished in a moment, and was not achieved by effort alone, and would not be complete in any person's lifetime on earth, but was nonetheless real, and was nonetheless happening. Thomas sat in the pew and listened. After the service, he walked back to the halfway house and sat on the back steps and thought about the person he had been at 34 and the person he was at 41 and the distance between them, which was not simply the 7 years. He thought about what it meant to become what you were made to be. He was not there. He was very far from there. But for the first time, he had a way of thinking about the gap that was not just the gap between who he was and who he was ashamed of having been. It was also the gap between who he was now and who he was being made into. That second gap felt different. It felt like a direction rather than a verdict. He did not know everything that meant. He was working on it. The spring air was cold still. He stayed on the steps for a while, thinking about the distance between where you are and what you are being made to become, and whether the distance itself is something to run from or something to walk toward. He decided it was something to walk toward. He went inside. He made dinner. He went to sleep. He went back to church the following Sunday. The 10th thing Jesus said about heaven is that it is not earthly life extended forever. There is a woman named Margaret who has been a widow for 11 years. She and her husband Roy were married for 49 years. They met at a church social in 1968 when she was 22 and he was 24, and he asked her to dance, and she said yes, and that was essentially the whole story of how it started. Simple and ordinary and completely unremarkable, except that it led to 49 years of a shared life that she would not have traded for anything she could name. He died on a Sunday morning in March, which she has always found slightly strange, because Sunday mornings had been their time. Not a romantic time exactly, but a particular kind of ordinary time that belonged to the two of them in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who had not experienced it. Coffee before church. The specific conversation that was neither serious nor unserious. The particular way he folded the newspaper and left it on the kitchen table even when there was nothing in it worth reading twice. She has been asked, in the 11 years since, by well-meaning people in various contexts, whether she believes she will see Roy again. She always says yes. She has believed that since the first week and has not stopped believing it. But the honest answer, the one she has only said out loud to her daughter and to her closest friend and to no one else, is that she is not entirely sure what she is picturing when she says yes. She is picturing Roy. She is picturing recognition, the moment of seeing him and him seeing her, and whatever that moment contains. But when she tries to picture what comes after that moment, when she tries to imagine what it would mean to continue being Margaret and Roy in eternity, she finds that she cannot hold the image together. It keeps dissolving into something she cannot see clearly. She does not say this because it sounds like doubt, and she does not want to be told she is doubting. She is not doubting. She is trying to understand something and finding that the understanding is harder than the believing. In the 22nd chapter of Matthew, a group of Sadducees came to Jesus with a question. The Sadducees did not believe in resurrection, which made the question they brought specifically designed to make resurrection look absurd. The question was about a woman who had been married 7 times, each time to a brother of her deceased husband under a specific marriage law, each husband dying before producing children. In the resurrection, they asked, whose wife will she be? 7 men had a legitimate claim. The system could not resolve it. Therefore, they implied, the system must not be real. Jesus said they were wrong, because they knew neither the scriptures nor the power of God. Then he said, in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. This is the sentence that people find either reassuring or troubling, usually depending on what they have brought to it from their own lives. For a person who has been in a deeply painful marriage, the sentence lands as relief. The structures that bound them to something damaging will not follow them into eternity. For a person like Margaret, who lost something she loved, the sentence can land as loss before it lands as anything else. The relationship she is hoping to return to, the specific structure of being Roy's wife and him being her husband. Jesus seems to be saying that structure will not exist in the resurrection in the same form it took here. It is worth sitting with this honestly rather than rushing to make it comfortable, because the discomfort is pointing at something real. Margaret's question is a real question. The feeling of potential loss underneath it is a real feeling. It does not help her to be given a reassurance that is not actually in the text. What is in the text is the phrase like angels in heaven. Jesus was not saying that resurrected human beings become angels. He was making a specific comparison about one aspect of angelic existence, namely, that angels are not organized into the marriage structure that human beings use to create family units and ensure the continuation of the human line. Marriage in the human world serves multiple purposes. It is companionship and love, and the particular knowing that comes from decades of shared life. But it is also partly a structure designed for a world where people die. The law the Sadducees referenced existed because when a husband died without children, the family line was in danger of ending. Marriage, as an institution, is, at least in part, shaped by mortality. It is how love builds something that might outlast the individual. In the resurrection, mortality is no longer the condition people are living inside, which means the structures that were designed to navigate mortality are no longer necessary in the same form. Jesus was not saying love disappears. He was not saying the 49 years Margaret and Roy shared will be erased. He was saying that the form those things take in eternity will not be constrained by the same requirements that shaped them on earth. The closest comparison is imperfect, but worth considering. When a child grows from infancy into adulthood, the relationship between the child and the parent does not end, but it changes form. The specific structures of that relationship, the feeding, the carrying, the way the parent managed every detail of the child's existence. Those structures are not the relationship itself. They were the form the relationship took at a particular stage. The relationship continues and deepens and becomes something that the infant version of it was pointing toward without being able to fully express. What Margaret and Roy had in 49 years was real, and it pointed toward something. What that something becomes in the resurrection will not be less than what it was. It will be more than the structure that held it here could contain. Jesus' response to the Sadducees did not fully answer Margaret's question. He was not trying to answer her question. He was answering a question designed to trap him, and he answered it by changing the frame entirely, by pointing out that the questioners were thinking about resurrection as earthly life extended indefinitely, which is the wrong frame. Resurrection life, in the way Jesus described it, is not this life with the problems removed. It is a different mode of existence, one that is better in kind rather than just better in degree. The love that exists there will be more real and more complete than the love here. Not because love disappears, but because everything that prevents love from being fully itself on earth will be gone. Margaret cannot picture what that means. Neither can anyone else. That is the honest answer to her question, and it is worth saying, without embarrassment. The resurrection is not described in the Gospels with the kind of detail that would allow anyone to construct a complete mental image of it. Jesus gave fragments. He said enough to orient the hope without satisfying the curiosity. What he did say clearly is that the God who raised him from the dead is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and that he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, and that in his presence those men are alive in a way that is real and complete, and not a diminished version of what they were. He said God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Margaret read this passage again on the 11th anniversary of Roy's death. She sat with it for a long time. She did not arrive at a picture. She did not get the mental image she had been trying to construct for 11 years. But she arrived at something else. A shift not in what she believed, but in how she was holding what she believed. She had been holding the hope of seeing Roy again, as the hope of returning to something, returning to the specific form of the specific life they had shared. And what Jesus seemed to be saying was that the hope is not a return. It is a forward movement into something that contains everything the 49 years were pointing at. Carried forward into a mode of existence that is larger than the structure that held it here. She did not fully understand what that meant, but she noticed that it made the hope feel bigger rather than smaller. The thing she was moving toward was not a reconstruction of what she had lost, but a completion of it. Not earthly life extended. Something the earthly life was always reaching toward. She told her daughter about this on the phone that evening. Her daughter was quiet for a moment and then said, "So, you are saying heaven is more than what we can picture?" Margaret said, "I think that is what he was saying." "Yes." Her daughter said, "That is either terrifying or wonderful." Margaret thought about it. She said, "I think it might be both. And I think both might be okay." She hung up and went to the window and looked at the yard and thought about Roy folding the newspaper on Sunday mornings. And the coffee. And the conversation that was neither serious nor unserious. And how all of that had been very good and had not been the whole story. She had believed that for 11 years. She understood it slightly better now. The 11th thing Jesus said about heaven is that eternity has already begun. There is a man named Paul who sold everything he owned at 43 years old. Not metaphorically. He sold the house and the car and most of the furniture and cashed out the retirement account and paid the penalties and took the remainder and moved across the country to be near his brother who had been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at 47. People in his life responded to this in different ways. His financial advisor told him he was making an irreversible mistake. 2 friends told him his brother would not know the difference soon anyway. Which was true, and also not the point. His mother cried. Not because she was unhappy he was going, but because she understood what it was costing him and could not fix that. His ex-wife, whom he had not spoken to in 4 years, sent him a text that said simply, "You always were the one who showed up." He did not feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had looked at 2 options and found that one of them was not actually available to him. He could not stay in his comfortable life in Denver and watch his brother disappear from a distance. That was not a real option. It looked like an option from the outside. From the inside, it was not one. He moved to Portland in October. He found an apartment close to his brother's house. He found consulting work he could do remotely that paid considerably less than what he had been earning. He spent 4 or 5 days a week with his brother, driving him to appointments, helping with the house, sitting with him through the long afternoons when Marcus, that was his brother's name, it was still largely present, and the conversation was mostly normal, and through the harder afternoons when it was not. People kept asking if he regretted it. He kept not knowing how to answer that question because it assumed a framework he did not share. Regret implies you made a choice you wish you had made differently. He had not made a choice exactly. He had seen something clearly and done the thing that seeing it clearly required. In the 13th chapter of Matthew, Jesus told a series of short parables about the kingdom of heaven. 2 of them stand side by side, and their brevity is almost startling after the longer parables that surround them. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who, on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. 2 stories. Same structure. A person encounters something of surpassing value. Everything else becomes, in that moment, obviously and without negotiation, less valuable. The selling is not the painful part. The selling is the natural consequence of the finding. You cannot hold on to everything once you have seen the thing worth holding on to. What these parables describe is not a transaction. They describe a reordering, a moment when the internal hierarchy of a person's values is rearranged by an encounter with something real. The man did not sell his possessions because he was told to, and then force himself to feel good about it. He sold them for joy. The joy came first. The selling followed from the joy, the way actions follow from what you actually believe, rather than what you say you believe. The treasure was already in the field before the man found it. The pearl existed before the merchant encountered it. The value of the thing was not created by the finding. The finding changed the finder. This is how Jesus described the kingdom of heaven operating, not as a future reality that becomes relevant only at death, as something that exists in the present, hidden in the ordinary field of ordinary life, available to be found by the person paying enough attention to notice it, and capable, once found, of reorganizing everything else around itself. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Jesus said in Matthew 4, "Not the kingdom of heaven will be available later upon completion of the required steps." At hand, present, accessible, already pressing through the surface of ordinary time into ordinary life. This changes the frame of everything. Heaven is not only what we move toward after death. It is the reality that begins to claim us now. The Father's house is being prepared, and the preparation is in the future. But the belonging it represents, the being known and expected and welcomed, that quality begins in the present. It begins the moment a person encounters something real enough to reorganize everything else around it. Paul did not use this language when he talked about why he moved to Portland. He was not particularly religious and would not have described what he did in terms of the kingdom of heaven. But when you asked him directly what had changed in him since he made the decision, he would say something that was hard to explain, but that came out the same way every time. He would say, "I found out what mattered." Not in the abstract, in the specific. He found out, by doing the thing, what the hierarchy actually was. And once he knew, he could not unknow it. And unknowing it would have required him to be a different person than the one he had, apparently, become at some point without fully noticing. The field did not look like anything special from the road. Fields rarely do. The man in the parable was not conducting a search for treasure. He was in the field doing ordinary work, and he found it. The finding was not the result of strategy or superior spiritual insight. He was paying attention. He noticed something. He did not walk past it. Paul spent Thursday afternoons with his brother Marcus in the later stages of the disease when the conversation was mostly gone. They watched baseball, which Marcus had loved his whole life and which retained some hold even when most other things had faded. Marcus could not always follow the game, but he would settle when it was on, and sometimes he would say something that indicated he was more present than he appeared. One Thursday afternoon in the 7th month after Paul moved to Portland, Marcus looked over at him during a commercial break and said clearly, without confusion, his full name, just his name, the way he had said it their whole lives. Paul said, "Yeah, I'm here." Marcus nodded. Look back at the television. That was the whole exchange. Paul sat there for a while after that. Something was happening in him that needed a moment. He looked at his brother watching the television, and he thought about the retirement account and the house in Denver, and the friends who had said Marcus would not know the difference. He thought, this is the field. This Thursday afternoon with my brothers saying my name. This is what I sold everything to be in. He was not thinking about heaven. He was thinking about his brother. But what he was experiencing in that moment, the weight of it, the completeness of it, the sense that everything happening in that room mattered in a way that the Denver life had not quite mattered. That was what Jesus was describing when he said the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. A man finds it. In his joy he goes and sells everything he has, and the selling does not feel like loss, because he found the field worth buying. The 12th thing Jesus said about heaven is a promise that changes how we live now. There is a man named James who wrote letters to his daughter every week for 2 years. He was stationed overseas with the army, a base in a country his daughter could not have found on a map at age 7, which was fine because he could not have found it on a map at 7 either, and he told her that in the first letter. He told her a lot of things in the letters that he would not have said out loud, because putting them on paper made them easier and also harder in ways he could not fully explain, even to himself. He wrote about what the sky looked like in the mornings there. He wrote about a dog that had adopted the base and had no name that anyone agreed on, so different people called it different things. He wrote about the food and the heat and the particular kind of waiting that military life involves more than most people who have not done it understand. He wrote about her, what he was imagining she was doing while he was sitting wherever he happened to be sitting when he wrote, what he thought she might be learning in school, how he pictured her face when she was concentrating on something difficult. And at the end of every letter, without exception, he wrote the same sentence. He did not plan to write it the first time. It came out, and he left it. Then he wrote it again the next week, and the week after that, and eventually it became the sentence his daughter looked for first when the envelope arrived. It said, "I am coming home. I do not know the day, but I am coming home." His daughter kept every letter in a shoebox under her bed. She read them when she missed him, which was often, and she read the last sentence of each one especially. Not because the sentence contained new information. The information it contained was minimal. A promise and an admission of uncertainty. She read it because the sentence did something to the space between his leaving and his returning. It made the space feel inhabited rather than empty. It made the waiting feel like something rather than just an absence. She told him this when he came home. She was 9 by then, and she had the shoebox, and she showed it to him, and he sat on the edge of her bed and went through the letters one by one, reading his own handwriting. And when he got to the last line of the first letter, he stopped for a moment and looked at it. He had not known when he wrote it that she would need it as much as she did. He had written it because it was true, and because it was the most important thing he had to say, and because everything else he wrote was somehow in service of it. On the last night Jesus spent with his disciples before his arrest, after he had spoken about the Father's house and the many rooms and the prepared place, he said, "And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." I will come again. The sentence is not complicated. It does not require extensive unpacking. It is a promise made by a person who is about to leave to the people who are about to be left. And its content is exactly what such a promise should contain. I am going. I will be back. The going is not the end of the story. What is worth sitting with is not the content of the promise, but its timing and its context. Jesus said this on the night he was betrayed. He said it after Judas had left the table, and before the soldiers arrived in the garden. He said it in the hours when the disciples could not yet see what was coming, but could feel the weight of it pressing in from every direction. He did not say, "Do not worry. Everything will be fine." He did not offer a comfortable reassurance that would dissolve under the pressure of what was about to happen. He said, "I am going to prepare a place, and then I am coming back to bring you there." The promise was forward-looking in the most literal sense. It pointed past everything that was about to happen. past the arrest and the trial and the cross and the burial, past even the resurrection, to a moment that had not yet arrived. And he held that future moment out to them in the present as if it were already established, already certain, already as real as the room they were sitting in, which is exactly how faith operates, not as wishful thinking about possibilities, as orientation towards something real enough to organize your present around. In the 24th chapter of Matthew, Jesus spoke at length about what would come before his return. He spoke about things that would happen, things that sounded difficult and in some cases catastrophic. And in the middle of all of it, he said, "Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come." The command is to keep watch, not to be afraid, not to perform increasingly anxious calculations about when and how. To keep watch. There is a difference between anxious vigilance and attentive waiting. And the difference is the person you are waiting for. A person waiting for an outcome they cannot control is anxious. A person waiting for someone they trust is attentive. The quality of the waiting is determined entirely by what you know about who is coming. Jesus was not telling his disciples to spend their remaining time in a state of fearful anticipation. He was telling them to live the way people live when they know someone is coming home, with their attention organized around that arrival, with their choices shaped by it, with their days lived in a way that will make sense when the one they are waiting for walks through the door. James's daughter lived differently because of the letters. She is not sure she would have described it this way at 9 years old. But looking back, she says the letters changed the texture of the 2 years he was gone. Without them, she thinks the absence would have felt final in a way that absence can feel when it is not bounded by any promise. With them, the absence felt temporary, not comfortable, not easy, but temporary, bounded on the other side by a return that was real even before it arrived. She did her homework. She went to school. She had ordinary fights with her mother and ordinary afternoons with her friends and ordinary mornings when she did not think about her father at all because there were other things to think about. The waiting was not all she did. It was the frame inside which she did everything else. That is what I Will Come Again does to a life when it is taken seriously. It does not remove the ordinary. It does not elevate every moment into drama or make the regular rhythms of daily existence feel spiritually charged in a way that would be exhausting to maintain. It provides a frame, an orientation, a direction that everything else is moving toward, whether or not you are consciously thinking about it in any given moment. The people who first heard and believed this promise were noted by observers around them for a quality that was hard to name precisely, but was consistently noticed. A combination of contentment and urgency that produced people who built things and gave things and cared for people and suffered with a quality of investment that you do not find in people who believe this life is all there is. They were not people who had checked out of the world while they waited for the world to end. They were people living in the present with one ear turned towards something coming, who were building and giving and loving and working with a seriousness that came from somewhere the observers could not quite locate. What those observers were seeing was people who had a letter, people who had been told, "I am coming back. I do not know the day, but I am coming back," and who had organized their lives inside that promise, the way a child organizes the weeks inside a shoebox of letters. "I will come again" changes the arithmetic of daily life, not by making the daily life unimportant, but by inserting it into a larger story that does not end with the current chapter. The thing you are doing today is part of something. The person you are becoming is moving toward a meeting. The love you are practicing is practice for something that will not require practice when it arrives, because it will simply be the native condition of the place you are in. Jesus said, "Where I am, there you may be also." He said, "I will come again." He said, "Keep watch." These are not 3 separate instructions. They are one instruction from 3 angles. Stay oriented. Stay present. Stay awake to the fact that the story you are living in is moving towards something, and that the something is personal and is coming. And the person coming is the one who knows your name and prepared your place and has been, in some sense, on his way back since the moment he left. James came home on a Wednesday afternoon in September. His daughter was in school. He had tried to time it for the weekend, and the timing had not worked out. He called his wife, and she drove to the school, and the school let the girl come to the front office, and she walked in, and he was standing there. She had the shoe box in her backpack because she had started carrying it to school after the 4th month. She had not told anyone why. She did not say anything when she saw him. She crossed the office in 4 steps, and he picked her up, and she held on and did not let go for a long time. He was home. The letters had told her he was coming. She had believed the letters. And the believing had made the space between his leaving and his returning something she could live inside without being consumed by it. That is what I will come again has always been for. Not to make the waiting easy. To make it livable. To make the distance between here and there something you can inhabit rather than something that inhabits you. He is coming. The promise was made by someone who knew the cost of making it and made it anyway. It is enough to keep watch by. It is enough to live toward. She woke up in the Hampton Inn in Columbus at 6:47 in the morning to the sound of a truck in the parking lot below. For 3 seconds, between sleep and waking, she did not remember where she was or why she was there. 3 seconds of ordinary morning. Then it came back. The room. The suit jacket on the bathroom door. 2 days before the funeral. She lay there for a while without moving. The truck finished whatever it was doing and drove away, and the parking lot went quiet again. The Bible was on the nightstand where she had left it. She had fallen asleep, reading, which she had not done in years. She picked it up and found her place in John 14. She read the whole chapter this time, not because she had not read it before, because the night before had done something to how she was reading it. Something she could not fully name but could feel the way you feel, a shift in the air before weather changes. The words were the same words. She was not quite the same reader. Do not let your hearts be troubled. She had said that sentence to people in hospital rooms and living rooms and parking lots. She had said it and meant it and delivered it with the confident fluency of someone who has been speaking a language for 40 years. She read it now as someone who needed it said to her. Not said by her. Said to her. In my Father's house are many rooms. She thought about the Sunday morning 40 years ago when she and her husband had walked into a church where they knew no one, and a woman in the 3rd pew had turned around and said, "Sit here. There is room." She had thought about that woman the night before, and she thought about her again now, and she realized something she had not considered before. She did not know what happened to that woman. She had never seen her again after they joined the church, and the woman must have moved or died. And there had never been an opportunity to tell her what she had done by turning around that morning and making space. The woman probably did not know she had done anything significant. It was such a small thing. Turning around. Saying there is room. But she had carried that moment for 40 years, without knowing she was carrying it. And sitting in the Hampton Inn on this particular morning, she understood that the moment had stayed because it was the kind of moment that stays. The kind that does not belong to the category of things that moths and rust can reach. She thought about her husband, not about where he was now in the metaphysical sense, not about the questions she had been turning over since Thursday, but about him specifically, the way he took his coffee, the sound he made when he laughed at something he had not expected to be funny, the specific weight of his hand when he put it on her shoulder. The 49 years of ordinary mornings that had accumulated into something she could not have named while she was inside it, and could see more clearly now that she was outside it. She understood something, sitting there, that she had not understood before, or had understood theoretically, and now understood differently. The 49 years were not the whole thing. They were the form the thing had taken here. The particular container that this world provided for something larger than the container. What they had built together across those years was real, and it was good, and it was pointing at something. The something it was pointing at was what she was moving toward. Not back toward. Forward. Toward. She had been thinking of the hope as a return. She understood now that it was not a return. It was a continuation into a mode that the 49 years could only hint at. That the best moments of those years were fragments of. That the woman in the third pew turning around was a small and ordinary instance of belonging, being expected. There is room. She got up and made coffee from the machine on the dresser. She stood by the window while it brewed and looked at the parking lot. A woman was loading a stroller into the back of an SUV with the focused efficiency of someone who has done it 1,000 times. A man in a suit was walking fast toward the entrance, with his phone already at his ear. Ordinary life, at its ordinary speed. She had been watching this parking lot since Thursday night, with the feeling that it was indifferent to her. That the world was continuing without any acknowledgement of what she was going through in room 416. She looked at it now and felt something different. Not that the world had noticed her. It had not. But she had noticed something about the world. That it was full of people carrying things. The woman with the stroller. The man on the phone. Every car moving through the lot. Everyone carrying something the people around them could not see and might never know about. She thought about what it would mean if the thing she had been saying for 40 years at other people's bedsides was true in the way she had always said it was true but had not. Until this week. You needed it to be true in the way you need water, and not just information about water. She thought it might be true in exactly that way. She did not arrive at certainty. She was not sure certainty was the right destination. What she arrived at was something more like what you feel when you are standing outside a house at night and you can see light coming from inside. You do not know everything about what is happening in the house. You cannot see through the walls. But the light is real, and it is coming from somewhere, and it means someone is there. She poured her coffee and sat in the chair by the window and called her daughter. She did not say any of what she had been thinking. She just said, "How are you?" And her daughter said, "How are you?" And they talked for 20 minutes about logistics and who was arriving when and where people were staying and what needed to happen before Saturday and all the ordinary detailed work of grief that has to be done by living people, regardless of what any of them are feeling about eternity. When they were finishing, her daughter said, "Are you okay, Mom?" She looked out at the parking lot. The woman with the stroller was gone. The man in the suit was gone. New people had arrived. New cars. The same ordinary morning. She said, "I think I am getting there." Her daughter said, "Okay. I will see you tomorrow." She hung up. She held the phone in both hands for a moment. Then she thought of something she had not thought of in a long time. When her children were young, and one of them had a bad dream and called out in the night, she would go to them. Not because they called strategically, or because the content of what they said was theologically sophisticated, or because they had any particular claim on her attention, beyond the fact that they were hers, and they were afraid, and she was their mother. She went because they called. Because calling was enough. Because the relationship between the caller and the one being called was the whole reason. She thought about the man on the cross beside Jesus. He had not cleaned up first. He had not earned anything or fixed anything or improved anything. He had just turned his head and asked not to be forgotten. And Jesus had answered him. She set the phone on the nightstand. She looked at the suit jacket on the bathroom door. She had been deciding whether to look at it or not look at it for 2 days. She looked at it now and stayed looking at it. Then she did something she had not done since Thursday. She talked to God about her husband. Not the way she had prayed in church for 40 years. With the language she had learned and the structures she trusted. The way you talk when the language runs out and what is left is just the truth of what you are carrying and the direction you are carrying it toward. She did not say anything eloquent. She did not arrive at resolution. She sat in the chair and looked at the jacket and said what was there, which was grief and love and the specific weight of 49 years and the question she had been sitting with since Thursday. The one about whether the thing she had always said was true in the way she needed it to be true. She did not get an answer in the way answers usually come. But something happened that was close to what happens when you have been holding something alone for a very long time and you finally say it out loud to someone you trust. The weight did not disappear, but it was no longer entirely hers. She sat there until the coffee was cold. Then she got up. She took the suit jacket off the door. She hung it carefully in the closet, on a hanger, the way you hang something you are going to need in 2 days and want to be ready. She showered. She got dressed. She went downstairs and had breakfast in the hotel restaurant by herself. She read the menu carefully and ordered eggs and toast and coffee and ate all of it. She had things to do. People were arriving. Saturday was coming. She did not have all her questions answered. She was not sure she ever would. Not on this side of whatever was on the other side. But she had something she had not had when she sat down in room 416 on Thursday night. Not answers. A direction. The ache she had been sitting with had a name now. It was not only grief, though it was that. It was the ache that Augustine described when he said, "Our heart is restless until it rests in you." The ache that is not a malfunction but a signal. The evidence, built into the human chest, that this world, as good as it can be, was never quite the whole story. You do not spend 40 years helping people find words for their grief without learning something about what the grief is reaching for. And what it reaches for, every time, is not simply the absence of pain. It reaches for presence, for belonging, for the sense that the love you have given and the love you have received is not going to be annihilated by time and death and the ordinary cruelty of things that end. Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many rooms." He said, "Where I am, there you may be also." He said, "I will come again." He said these things to frightened people in a room where everything was about to fall apart. And he said them like they were the most stable things in the universe, because he believed they were, and because he was the one who had been to the Father's house and back and knew what was there and what was waiting and who was expected. She knew all of that. She had known it for 40 years. She was learning, in room 416 of the Hampton Inn in Columbus, Ohio, what it meant to need it to be true rather than simply to know that it was. There is a difference between those two things. The difference is everything. Outside, the parking lot went on being a parking lot. People arrived and left and arrived again. The ordinary world at its ordinary pace, carrying its ordinary weight of grief and hope, and the specific load of lives being lived inside the question of whether any of it means anything beyond the living of it. It means something. The Father's house is real. The place is being prepared. And the ache you have been carrying, the one that no earthly thing has ever fully resolved, the one that shows up in the best moments, as well as the worst, because even the best moments are not quite enough. That ache has a name. It is homesickness. And home is not behind you. It is ahead.